Jose on January 22nd, 2019. I've named it Resolving the Science-Religion Problem. Last week, I walked on the beach for the first time with no pain in almost 12 years. I had my ankle replacement replaced last January, and that is kind of a hellish surgery. I was awake during it too because I opted out of general anesthesia. About a quarter of the way into the surgery, I regretted that, but hey, I survived. Anyway, the surgeon fixed the problem being a crooked ankle replacement, installed 10 years prior. Isn't that crazy? So after about a half a mile walking in the sand, I literally cried with appreciation. It was beautiful. I had overlain my experience of beaches with sadness and hatred and frustration, and that's gone now. It's a hell of a lot easier when you're not in pain. Sometimes the beauty in life is overwhelming. Just wanted to share that with everybody because it was really overwhelming and it made my day. Exciting news. Dad is launching his very first e-course on December 17th, 2019. It's available for pre-sale currently. A lot of people have been asking us for a more structured and condensed resource where they can learn about personality without needing to spend 30 plus hours watching videos, reading resources, etc. So earlier this year, we recorded a new video series that will be packaged as an online course with 8 videos, supplementary materials, including lecture notes, additional reading materials and resources, transcripts, a free license to the Understand Myself personality assessment, and an exclusive discussion group, all designed to give you an in-depth look and understanding of your personality. Personality is my favorite topic in psychology. It's worth checking out if you've been intending to learn about personality and want to do it in a concise and structured format. Dad's released a lot of information about personality on YouTube for free, but this is a more concise, structured way of learning and features some information on personality differences between genders, so that's cool. Go to jordanbpeterson.com/personality to check it out. If you're listening to this podcast before December 17th, 2019, we're currently offering a pre-sale for a 15% discount on the course at $120. If you're interested, this is a great opportunity to get it at a lower price or buy it for someone for Christmas even. Hopefully you find it cool. I did. I sat in on all the lectures even though I had food poisoning at the time. Imagine getting food poisoning when you only eat one thing. Not ideal, but I still sat through the lectures. They're that good. Check it out at jordanbpeterson.com/personality. Resolving the Science-Religion Problem, a Jordan B. Peterson 12 Rules for Life lecture.
It's been a while since I talked to a large audience. I talked to an audience in Zurich a week ago, but that was in a completely different time zone. So, and I was just trying to recapitulate in my imagination what it is that I was trying to do with 12 Rules for Life and with my first book, Maps of Meaning. And so I was laying that out, and I think I'll walk through that again. I kind of get warmed up to the topic. It's a complicated thing to lay out in total. So the first issue is, I think, that these are issues that everybody knows, but all these issues that I'm going to lay out are related. So the first issue that everybody knows is that there's a conflict between religion and science. And so that's a conflict that's torn at the heart of our culture for about 500 years. Especially as scientific progress has become more self-evident. And there's been a lot of really good things about that, obviously. Science has driven a technological revolution, and it's radically improved our standard of living, our material well-being, and it's very difficult not to think of that as a good thing. And one of the things that's really remarkable about that is that it's accelerating, by all appearances. It really took off in the late 1800s, and that it's happening everywhere in the world. And so there's been an unbelievably rapid economic transformation throughout the world, especially in the last 20 years. So, the bulk of the population in the world now is middle class. And starvation is virtually a thing of the past, although not entirely, and even extreme privation from a material perspective is declining very rapidly. The UN defines extreme privation as existence on less than $1.90 a day in today's dollars. And that's declined 50% since the year 2000, which is absolutely phenomenal. And the UN projects that it will be eradicated completely by the year 2030. And just to put things in perspective, in the West, before 1895, the typical person lived on $1 a day. So that's less than the current UN standard for extreme privation. And so the technological revolution that's been driven in large part by the dawn of scientific thinking has radically altered the West and its standard of living, but now is doing the same thing everywhere else in the world. So, here's another example. The child mortality rate in Africa is now the same as it was in Europe in 1952. So that's just absolutely beyond belief. So this is a good thing. But the conflict between the scientific viewpoint and the religious viewpoint still exists. Carl Jung, who's a favorite thinker of mine, a psychoanalytic thinker who wrote and thought through most of the 20th century. He died in 1960. So I guess for the first 6/10 of the 20th century. He believed that what had happened about 500 years ago was that as science developed out of alchemy, which was like the dream, alchemy was the dream out of which science emerged. Alchemy was the dream that you could discover a material substance, which was the philosopher's stone, that would confer upon everyone health, wealth, and longevity. And of course, there is no philosopher's stone, but the dream was correct, because the dream was that if we studied the material world with enough care, that we could discover something that would produce wealth and health and longevity, and that did happen. And so sometimes things that occur in actuality have to be dreamed before they occur. Alchemy had an ethical aspect and a practical aspect, let's say. And the practical aspect exploded up into the scientific revolution and gave us this incredible technological power. But it was Jung's belief that the ethical element remained undeveloped, and that was dangerous. And that we were now in a situation, and have been for quite a while, where our technological power outstrips our ethical knowledge. And part of that's manifested in an uncertainty about ethics in general, about how to behave, about whether there is even an answer to the question how to behave, about whether or not there is such a thing as an ethic that isn't morally relative or arbitrary in some sense. And I think you see that critique manifested most particularly in the postmodern doctrine, which claims with some justification that there's a very large number of ways of looking at the world, and that none of those ways, there's no straightforward way to determine which one of that multitude of manners that you can view the world is correct. Now there's a corollary problem. You have the religion and science problem, and you have a philosophical problem that David Hume pointed out, which is that it isn't obvious how you can derive an ought from an is. And an ought is an ethic. It's how you should behave. And an is a description. And you could think of the scientific method as an attempt to describe what is, and the ethical endeavor as an attempt to describe what ought to be. And according to Hume, there was a gap between the two, and it wasn't a straightforward thing to bridge. And that seems to be right. So there's a parallel problem, the is-ought problem, the science-religion problem. So I was very interested in that those parallel sets of problems. And that's what I've been trying to address. And that's what I wrote about in 12 Rules for Life and in Maps of Meaning. I started to hypothesize a long while back that in a similar manner that there were two ways of looking at the world. You could look at the world as a place of objects, a place of material objects, or you could look at the world as a place to act. And that's the same idea reflected in a different way. The world as a place of objects, that's the is world, that's the world science describes. And the world as a place to act, that's the ought world. And then I realized too, and this was partly from studying the psychoanalysts, but also from studying literature first and the psychoanalysts second, was that the world as a place to act is laid out in stories. And that maybe the world is like a stage that's set for a drama, you know. You walk in like you walked in tonight. You look at the stage and there's no characters on it to begin with. There's just the objects on the stage, the speakers and the chair, and the stage is set. And you could know everything about the stage setting from a scientific perspective, and you still would have no idea what drama was about to take place. Yet the purpose of the stage and the purpose of the play is the drama, and the stage setting, the objects are in some sense almost peripheral to that. And you know that too because you've seen plays and movies, and you know how many different ways you can set a stage for the drama to occur. The question is, well, what constitutes the drama? So I got interested in the drama. And because the point of the stage is the play and not the setting. I got interested in the drama. And I started to understand that the drama had a structure. And that the structure, just like the material world has a structure, just like there's a periodic table of the elements, there's a periodic table in some sense, there's a periodic table of dramatic personae. And if you understand them, you can start to understand how to act in the world. And there is actually a way to act in the world that's not arbitrary. When I was writing Maps of Meaning, which was my first book, I was trying to address a question that was a postmodern question, although I didn't know it at the time. I hadn't conceptualized it at the time. And the question was this. I was obsessed by the fact that the world had divided itself into two armed camps. The armed camp that constituted essentially the Soviet Union, but you could say the entire communist bloc, and then the West. And that each of those two blocs had arranged their societies according to different axiomatic presumptions and were at odds with one another. And it wasn't obvious, the world wouldn't have divided itself into those two armed camps, if it was obvious which of those two sets of axiomatic presuppositions were more valid, let's say. Or maybe the problem was even deeper than that, which was those were just two arbitrary sets of axiomatic presuppositions out of a very large number of potential sets, and they just happened to be the ones that emerged, and they were at odds with one another. And so I started to study the understructure of the two belief systems to see if one of them had more validity than the other, if I could figure that out, if there was something underneath at least one of them. And what I discovered, I think, was that the belief system that characterized the societies of the West, the underlying belief system, wasn't arbitrary. It was just correct. And I think the fact that the Soviet Union fell apart so precipitously in 1989 is actually evidence of the unplayability of the Soviet game. That's a really good way of thinking about it. There are some games you can play and there's some games you can't play. If you iterate some games, they degenerate, and if you iterate others, they improve. And that's actually one of the pieces of evidence that suggests that one system is preferable to another, that you can iterate it across time, and that's actually not a degenerating game, but an improving game. And, if you have a relationship with someone, it's an iterated game, right? It's iterated because it repeats. if you have a permanent relationship with someone, a marriage, a friendship, a relationship between siblings, relationship between you and your children, you want to be able to interact with them in a manner that doesn't get worse across time. Maybe at least it stays flat, but it would be better if it even got better. That would be lovely. And your successful relationships are at least ones that maintain the status quo, but the great ones improve across time. And so there are ways that you can interact iteratively with people in a manner that sustains that iteration and fortifies it. And so some games aren't playable, and some games are. Some games improve as you play them. And the game that the communists played was a degenerating game. And that meant that there was something wrong with it. And that meant that at least that way of looking at the world wasn't as good as any other way. Which is interesting, because at least it suggests that there's one way of looking at the world that isn't as good as another way. Right? And that's a bothersome fact in some sense if you're a moral relativist. Because as soon as there's any evidence that one game isn't as good as another, you've got some evidence that some games are better than others. And so then you have some evidence that there's a rank order, let's say, of games. When Solzhenitsyn wrote about the Nazi Holocaust, he talked about the Nuremberg trials. And he believed that the Nuremberg trials were among the most important events of the 20th century. He's making a similar case. And the reason he believed that was because the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials, and you have to think about whether or not you believe this, because there's a cost to believing it and there's a cost to not believing it. So there's no scot-free way out of this conundrum. The conclusion of the Nuremberg trials was that there were some things that you could not do if you were human without being subject to moral sanction, regardless of your cultural milieu. Right? Those were what have come to be known as crimes against humanity. So the Nuremberg trials made it axiomatic that some things were wrong, independently of the moral structure within which you were raised. Or another way of thinking about it was that no matter what moral structure it was that you were raised within, there was something common across all of them that would make the sorts of things that the Nazis did wrong by any reasonable standard. Now, you don't have to believe that, but if you don't believe that, then that puts you in an awkward position with regards to the Holocaust, say. Well, that's what I mean by a cost. It's like you either admit that there's something wrong, or you admit that there wasn't anything wrong with the Holocaust and that it was just an arbitrary cultural decision, one of many such arbitrary cultural decisions, and of no more distinction than any other. And that seems like it seems like a conclusion that in the main we're not willing to draw. So, maybe there is a difference between wrong and right. And that's worth thinking about. And then and maybe that difference is real, whatever real might mean. Now, let's think about the problem of how to act. I'll think about it biologically, because that's what I tried to do when I was writing Maps of Meaning. And in 12 Rules for Life, there's also a biological approach. I mean, I drew on a lot of religious stories when I wrote both those books, which is a strange thing to do if you're also trying to think biologically, because those two things don't necessarily exist harmoniously. The more strict scientific types, Sam Harris being a good example, aren't comfortable with religious presuppositions. And so the attempt to use a standpoint derived from physics and a standpoint derived from biology, say, social science for that matter, and to ally that with religious presuppositions is an awkward marriage. But it can be done. I should tell you a story about Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget was probably the greatest child developmental psychologist of the 20th century. He invented the field. He had a messianic crisis when he was a young man, and he was tormented by the contradiction between science and religion, and decided that he was going to devote his entire life to rectifying that. And I actually think he managed it to a large degree. You know, it's not generally how Piaget is discussed. When we discuss great people, we generally don't discuss them in their full peculiarity. You know, you remember a while back, Elon Musk was sort of savaged for smoking, 1/1000th of a joint on Joe Rogan. And I thought it was so comical because Elon Musk is a very strange person. Now, obviously, you have to be a strange person to build an electric car and then shoot it on your own rocket out into space. Right? Seriously, like... Right? Either one of those things is really strange, but the joint probability of doing both is way below zero. So I thought it was comical that people went after Musk, because I thought, yes, well, we like our insane geniuses predictable and normal. It's like... Anyways, Piaget did do a very good job of reconciling religion with science, although people don't really know that, because that isn't how they read Piaget. And I think that's partly because they're afraid of if you read someone who's really a genius, the depth of their genius will frighten you. And so you'll only read down into their work till you hit what you can't abide, and then you'll stop. And that's the case with Freud, and it's the case with Jung for sure, because if you read Jung and you have any sense, you're terrified instantly. And then it's also the case with Piaget. And so I'll weave in what it was that he discovered. Okay, so we're going to think about this biologically. So let's say, well, one of the problems you have is what the world is made out of. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting about human beings is that we really didn't care about that very much for a very long period of time, right? I mean, we didn't invent science until about 500 years ago. Now, you can argue about that, and you could say that the precursors for the scientific viewpoint were laid down by the Greeks, and then we could say, okay, well, that was 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago. But who cares? If you're thinking biologically, the difference between 500 years and 3,000 years that's no difference at all, because human beings in their current form are 150,000 years old. That's the estimate. There's been creatures basically identical to us genetically for 150,000 years, and we diverged from chimpanzees 7 million years ago, and so we were vaguely human for 7 million years. And so in the span of, let's say, 2 million years, just to, give the later proto-humans their advantage, the difference between 500 years and 3,000 years is completely trivial. The point is that we didn't invent anything approximating science, and we weren't concerned about the structure of the material world in any objective sense until like yesterday. And really, we managed to survive without it. And then, of course, there's the 3.5 billion years of biological evolution that preceded even the emergence of human beings that existed in the absolute absence of anything approximating a scientific perspective, which indicates that, well, that perspective appears to not be strictly necessary from the perspective of survival, and B, that something else was occurring to provide us with the knowledge that we needed during all of that time. And so when I read Nietzsche decades ago, he talked about how philosophy emerged. So he was an analyst of philosophers. And it was Nietzsche's idea that what the typical philosopher, perhaps even including him, but perhaps not him, produced was an unconscious recapitulation of their own knowledge. That they felt that what they were doing was coming up with a rationalistic account of the structure of behavior, let's say. But really what they were doing was noticing how they acted and then describing that and providing it with a rationale. And so it was bottom up, not top down. So we might think about that. We might think about that because one of the things we do know is that however it was that creatures, animals, us, figured out how to act, over the millions of years that they figured out how to act, it was bottom up and not top down. The simpler the animal, the less capable it is of thinking. And so if you go back far enough, and you don't have to go back that far, you get creatures that can't think at all. Like, there's lots of complex multi-celled organisms that don't have much of a nervous system, and they don't think, they just act, they just exist. And so whatever they're doing isn't a consequence of thinking, it's a consequence, the fact that they know what they're doing is a consequence of something other than thinking. And even more sophisticated animals, mammals, let's say, act and don't think. And so, but they act in sophisticated ways. And so I was reading some of the ethologists about the same time. Ethologists are scientists who study animal behavior. They're not like laboratory behaviorists. They don't put the animals in a controlled environment and do experiments on them. They just use naturalistic observations. So you can imagine Jane Goodall was an ethologist, for example, and she studied chimpanzees. There's a guy named Konrad Lorenz in Scandinavia, and he studied geese and other animals, dogs as well. And so these are people who just, and Diane Fossey, I think it was Fossey that, now was she gorillas? I think it was gorillas. Yeah, and so you go out and watch the animals, and Goodall, when she was watching chimpanzees, what she'd do is, well, she'd look for regularities, but she also found herself telling stories. So you read Goodall's accounts of chimpanzees, you get stories about what the chimpanzees are like, and she gave them all names, and you can see the personalities of the chimpanzees emerging in her accounts. And that's kind of interesting because what it suggests is that if you're looking for how a set of creatures interact, you tend to look at them as if their personalities acting something out, acting out patterns. Say like wolf pack. If you watch a wolf pack for a while, you're going to see patterns, regular patterns of behavior that characterize the interactions between the wolf pack. Has to be that case, right? Because otherwise the wolves couldn't predict one another. If there was no regularity, there'd be no predictability. There'd just be chaos. And so what happens is the wolves settle into predictable patterns of behavior. The chimpanzees settle into predictable patterns of behavior. And then you can tell stories about those predictable patterns of behavior. And you might even be able to derive rules. You might say, well, it's as if the chimpanzees are acting out this rule. So here's a rule that you might act out if you were a wolf. So let's say you're a male wolf and there's another male wolf around, and you decide that you're going to have a dominance dispute, right? And so you puff up your fur and you look rough and tough and you bare your teeth and you growl and you threaten and you terrify. And maybe you even fight to some degree, but not too much because you don't want to damage each other. Because the person, the wolf that you're fighting with, you might need tomorrow to bring down a moose with, right? So that's an interesting thing to consider because it constitutes a limit on the kind of aggression that's allowable in the pursuit of dominance. Anyways, two wolves will go at it, and usually what happens is one wolf decides it's not worth the risk, and he rolls over and presents his throat to the victor. And that basically means something like, well, I'm useless and weak, and you can tear out like a prey animal, and you can tear out my throat if you so choose. And the dominant wolf acts out something like, well, I know you're useless and weak, but I might need you to haul down a moose tomorrow, so despite the fact that you're not good for anything, you might as well get up and we'll get on with it. Now, obviously, the wolves aren't thinking that, but that's how they act. And so if you're watching and you can think and you describe how they act, that might be how you describe it. And so I just described it in words. I used what would be approximately the description of a rule. The rule would be, If you're a wolf pack, don't kill each other because you need the whole pack to pull down your prey. Right. So there's a constraint on striving. And you can lay it out in a rule-like manner. And I told a little story, and then I derived a rule from it. And that's how we act emerged. So each of us pursues our own motivated behaviors, but then we aggregate together in groups. And the fact that we aggregate together in groups puts certain restrictions on how it is that we manifest our motivated behavior. Partly because we depend on each other, like the wolves depend on each other. And so what that means is that there's an ethic that emerges out of the interactions between those motivations, and that ethic manifests itself in a certain kind of pattern behavior. Now that's about as far as it goes for wolves, because they don't sit around at the campfire at night and talk about how it is that wolves interact with one another. But human beings do that, see, because we've got this next level of cognitive ability, imaginative ability. It's not just pure abstract thought. It's not like we've got motivation like other animals, and then we've got the patterns of behavior that emerge out of as a consequence of the interaction of those motivated behaviors. We then have the ability to watch ourselves like we would watch a wolf pack, right? Because an anthropologist, an ethologist can go out in the wild and watch a wolf pack or watch a chimpanzee troop and take notes. Say, look, here are the patterns. I can write down the patterns. And when I write down the patterns, then I'm telling a story. And out of the story, I can abstract rules. But the chimps aren't doing that. The wolves aren't doing that. But the human being can do that. And then the human being can say, well, it's as if wolves follow these rules, which they don't, because they're wolves. And they don't follow rules. But they do manifest patterns. And the patterns emerged as a consequence of something approximating an evolutionary competition. Now, it's interesting. It's very interesting to think this through. So, Frans de Waal, who's another ethologist who studies chimpanzees, he's written a bunch of great books. You might be interested in them if you're interested in this sort of thing. He's been interested in the emergence of morality among chimpanzees. And so, one of the things de Waal has found was that, and this is partly why the postmodernists who insist that the fundamental motivator for the structure of hierarchies is power are wrong. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. They're wrong. Okay, it's seriously important because one of the claims that's tearing our culture apart is that our hierarchical structure, which would be our entire culture, is an oppressive patriarchy, and that the people who occupy the positions, especially the higher positions, let's say, in the hierarchy, got there because they exercised power. Right? That's a fundamental claim of Foucault, for example, who's an absolutely reprehensible scholar on about 15 different dimensions. But one of them is his narrow-minded insistence that power is the only justification for hierarchical position. Now, I think that's patently absurd in the case of human beings, but I won't go there to begin with, because I might as well make the case that it's patently absurd in the case of animals, where it's more like power. De Waal has shown, well, you got the example of the wolf already. It's like you just can't be savaging up your pack mates, because all you do is demolish the structure within which you live. And that's true for wolves. You know, it's true for chimpanzees. So de Waal has shown in a sequence of observations, and chimps are a good test case because we're rather chimp-like. Now, well, they're our closest biological relatives, right? So it's only a 7 million year gap between us and the common ancestor. So if you're going to look at any animal and derive conclusions about the basal motivations of human beings, well, then it would be chimps that you would look at. You might look at bonobos too, although the differences between bonobos and chimps has been exaggerated by all appearances. But in any case, You can get to the top if you're the roughest, toughest, meanest, most physically powerful, and cruelest chimpanzee. But your rule is unstable. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that chimpanzees, the males, females as well, but the fundamental hierarchy for chimps is male. Chimpanzees are competitive, but they're also cooperative. They spend a lot of time grooming each other, and they actually have long-term friendships. And it turns out that 2 chimpanzees that are 3/4 as tough as the toughest chimpanzee make a pretty vicious set of opponents if you get a little bit too tyrannical. And the problem with pure power for the chimpanzees is that if you're a chimp that climbs to the top as a consequence of nothing but psychopathic dominance, you have no allies and no friends because you don't engage in any cooperative behavior. You'll have an off day and your 2 lieutenants, each of whom is 3/4 as strong as you, will band together and tear you into bits. It's an unstable, medium to long-term solution. Power. And I see no reason to assume that exactly the same thing isn't the case with human beings. If it doesn't work for chimpanzees and it doesn't work for wolves, why in the world would it work for human beings? Especially when you think that our hierarchies are way more complicated than the hierarchies that characterize animals, and that we do all sorts of things with our hierarchies that animals don't do. I mean, most of you have jobs, and most of those jobs are, while you're performing most of those jobs, you're not doing things that any animal would do now, or that any human being would have done 300 years ago. Now, there's certain exceptions to that. Some of you might farm, but even if you're doing that, you're not doing it in a way that people did it 300 years ago. Whatever your job is, and it's likely to be very abstract, you're pursuing some goal that is fairly distant from a fundamental biological motivation. It's very abstract, and you're actually creating something of at least sufficient value so that other people will trade with you for it. And the idea that you're going to move up in your hierarchy of production by exercising something like psychopathic power is, I think that's insane to think that. You know, and I think about plumbers, for example. I've used this joke before, but I like it, so I'm going to use it again. It's like, you know, if the postmodernists were right, this is how you'd hire a plumber. First of all, the plumbers would have all banded together, although they'd be fighting within themselves because, of course, there's nothing but power. But they would have all banded together, and they'd go from door to door, and they basically knock on your door and tell you that if you didn't hire them, there was going to be hell to pay. It'd be like mafia plumbers. And then you'd pick the roughest, toughest plumber who's best at exercising power to not fix your pipes, because why would he be interested in fixing your pipes? He'd just be interested in pretending to fix your pipes and taking your money, which is how you'd expect a mafioso plumber to operate. But that isn't how it works, right? I mean, if you hire virtually anyone in your day-to-day life, you suss out their reputation for their ability to provide the service that they promise to provide, which is predicated on their skill, their technical skill, their skill as workmen and craftsmen. It also is predicated on their ability to generally work in some reasonably interactive way with their employees, because otherwise they don't stay in business for that long, and also to treat their customers with a modicum of reciprocal respect, or their reputation is savaged immediately and they fail. And so this patriarchal structure that we hypothetically all occupy, that's fundamentally predicated on oppression and power, breaks apart into something approximating cooperative competence when you look at any of its subcomponents. You know, you don't have power-hungry massage therapists, you know. Well, I don't understand how the entire structure can be a power-dominated, oppressive patriarchy if none of the subcomponents are. It doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm not saying at all that within large hierarchies there isn't room for relatively psychopathic people to now and then manage a certain amount of success. You know that as a hierarchical structure grows in size, that pure power politic players have a higher probability of success. But all that happens to large organizations when they get completely dominated by people who are using power and politics as a means to climb to the top is that they precipitously collapse, because you end up with no one who can actually perform the function that the structure is supposed to perform, and a whole plethora of people who are good at doing nothing but playing politics. And then the company dies. And the thing is, companies die all the time. The typical Fortune 500 company lasts 30 years. And the reason for that often is that it's functional for a while, and then it gets corrupted by internal politics, or it gets blind, or it can't keep up, or whatever it is, and that's the end of it. It falls apart and, breaks into its constituent elements, and they reformulate. Maybe there's some new companies that come out of it, but it's not a permanent structure by any stretch of the imagination. And so I don't think there's any reason whatsoever to assume, well, we can think this through. Are our hierarchical structures based on power, or are they based on competence? And look, the answer is, well, they're a bit based on power, because you shouldn't be naive about this. Hierarchical structures can and do become corrupt in some ways, and we have to keep an eye on that all the time. But my sense is that by and large, things work. Here we are, we're sitting in this hall, and there's 3,000 of us, and you all got here because your cars worked, and the highways work, sort of. I was in a traffic jam for like an hour and a half getting here, but that's what happens when you drive somewhere at 5 o'clock. You can predict that. So they worked, and the lights are on, and they seem to work, and that's no trivial thing. And looks like the big TV screen is working, and you're all sitting here peacefully, not engaging in an overt power struggle, as far as I can tell, even though there's a hierarchical arrangement of seats, right? You accept that, and you accept the fact that, some of you paid a premium for sitting closer, and that seems to be a reasonable way of distributing somewhat scarce resources, and everyone in here is behaving peacefully, and all this seems to work quite nicely. And so since this all works, it's very difficult for me to understand how it's not predicated, at least in large part, on competence. And then, of course, there's the other evidence, which is, well, a lot of you are older than the average person would have been when he or she died throughout the history of the entire human race. And so that seems to be working out pretty good for you. And none of you are skinny. Quite the contrary. So there are more obese people in the world now than there are starving people, by quite a substantial majority. And I think that's worth quite the celebration, even though it's perhaps not exactly optimized. But it's definitely better than the alternative. And, by and large, we're moderately healthy. And most women don't die in childbirth like they used to, and most children don't die within a year of being born like they used to not very long ago. And so things seem to be working. Not so bad, given what a bloody catastrophe life is, and how difficult it is to get things to work, and how fragile people are, and how short-lived we are intrinsically, and how vulnerable we are to suffering. We're not doing so bad, We must be doing something right. And this is the thing. This is the thing that I would say enrages me about, let's call them universities. And it's the intellectual and moral laziness of the resentful, victimization, power, postmodern doctrine. Because, look, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the history of humanity is a bloody nightmare. And, to lay that only at the feet of human beings, I think, is a mistake. Because life in the natural world is a bloody nightmare. And so you can't just blame that on people. Like you can blame it on people to some degree. We take a bad thing, or we take a deadly thing, or a dangerous thing, and we can make it worse. And we definitely do that. But it's not like the problem is simple to begin with, because it's clearly the case that at every moment, the planet is trying to kill you. And eventually it will succeed. And so that's a big problem. And it's reasonable for us to group together and to try to stop that. And while we're doing that, we cause some trouble. We pollute things and we break things and we don't play as good an iterating game as we might. But, for creatures that only last 8 decades and have a lot of trouble during all 8 of those, we don't do that badly. And we've got our reasons for being as perverse and useless as we are. And all of that shouldn't be laid at our feet, even though we need to take responsibility for it. And so one of the things that I find extremely disturbing about the emergent hypothesis that our culture is nothing but an oppressive patriarchy is that it's ungrateful beyond comprehension. And worse, if you adopt that stance, well, it bestows a certain amount of benefit on you. I mean, first of all, if you posit that there's nothing in your culture except what's corrupt, then that immediately elevates you above all of it as that sort of critic, right? It's like, well, I'm taking the high ground and I'm looking at the entire history of humanity and calling it unacceptable. It's like, well, that's fine, I suppose, except it isn't necessarily obvious that you could do any better, and you probably haven't, and maybe you could try, although then you might say, well, just try, all that trying does is make it worse. And participating in that terror, doing anything of any utility is just playing the power game and making it worse. It's like, yeah, well, pardon me for being a bit skeptical about your motivation. I don't think that moral virtue is that easily come by. And I think that there are difficult problems to solve and that you could contend with the world and try to solve them instead of complaining about the fact that they haven't been solved properly. And that if you did manage to solve a problem or two, which you might, then maybe you'd have the right to stand up as a more global critic. But until then, well, what's Rule 6? You should get your house in order before you criticize the world. And that's no simple thing. But so the moral virtue thing, that's annoying because I don't think that moral virtue should be unearned. This is kind of why I'm an admirer of the doctrine of original sin. I think you're stuck with some concept of original sin no matter how you think. I mean, I see that in the atheistic environmentalist types, and I know all environmentalist types aren't atheistic, and I know that all environmentalist types aren't reprehensible either. But there's a nice selection of atheist environmental types who are reprehensible. And they're usually the ones that say that the world would be better off if there were fewer people on it, which is not a sentiment that I find particularly attractive. And it's also one, when I meet someone who utters that, I always think 2 things. One is, well, why are you still here then? That's the first one. And the second one is, just exactly who is it that you're planning on getting rid of, and how exactly would you go about doing that if you had the opportunity? So I don't find that particularly admirable, and I don't think that there's any sympathy in it, because I think that we should have some sympathy for ourselves. That's rule 2, is you should treat yourself like you're someone responsible for helping. Or rule 3, which is you should make friends with people who want the best for you. It's like, corrupt and useless as you are, you do have a hard lot. And so there's some reason for sympathy. And to say that human beings are nothing but despoilers of the planet is to miss half the story, which is as fast as we're trying to kill Mother Nature, she is returning the favor in spades. So that doesn't mean that we should be foolish about it, and a certain balance has to be attained. But it's nice to look at both sides of the equation before you lay out too much judgment. Back in the late 1800s, Thomas Huxley, who was Aldous Huxley's great-grandfather and also a great defender of Darwin, was commissioned by the British Parliament to do a study on oceanic resources, because there was some concern at that point that human beings might be overfishing. And his conclusion was the oceans were so bountiful and plentiful, and human beings so comparatively small in number and powerless, that there wasn't a hope in hell that we would ever be able to put a dent in the vast resources of the ocean. And that was only at the beginning of the 20th century. We didn't get to the point where we could harvest on an industrial scale until after World War II. That's only about 70 years ago. And so it's only been 50 years, say, maybe a bit more, 60 years, maybe since 1960, that we woke up to the fact that some of our actions had now become powerful enough to be considered on a global scale. And that's within the lifetime. That's within my lifetime. That's within the lifetime of a single person. I don't think we've done such a bad job of waking up since then and starting to understand that, maybe we have a larger scale moral obligation than we realized before that's proportionate to our technological power. It's another place where a little bit of sympathy might be in order. And I mean, LA is a lot cleaner than it used to be in terms of its air quality, and so is London. And, we've made a lot of progress, I would say, in a relatively short time trying to clean up the mess that we made when we were trying not to die painfully young. So... All right, well, back to this ethics. So I'll tell you another study that I really like that's really cool. So this is a study that was done by a guy named Jaak Panksepp, and he did it with rats. And now and then, I love reading animal experimental work. If you want to study psychology, that's what you should read. You should just read animal experimental work, because those people, it's not all good, but some of it's really good. And some of the people who've done it, they were real scientists. And this guy, Panksepp, he's one of them. Got another guy named Jeffrey Gray, who wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which takes you like 8 months to read. It's a really hard book, but it's brilliant. Anyways, Panksepp has done a really good job of laying out the fundamental motivational systems in their biology. I'll just tell you a brief story about that. The American Psychological Association just came out with its guidelines for the treatment of men and boys. It's actually, they're not guidelines, they're not for treatment. And they're certainly not for the improvement of the health of men and boys. It's an absolutely reprehensible ideological screed on how psychologists have to think politically so they won't be punished by those who accredit them. That's it fundamentally. But one of the claims they made two claims that are beyond comprehension to me. The first one was that aggression is socialized. So that's the first claim. And the second claim is that boys are socialized into aggression by men. Okay, so let's look at those. This relates to Panksepp. So Panksepp outlined a bunch of biological circuits. So human beings, like mammals, but also like even more archaic animals, speaking evolutionarily, have a variety of fundamental biological circuits. So I can tell you some of them. Some of them are obvious and some of them are somewhat surprising. You have a circuit for pain. Well, there's no surprise. You have a circuit for anxiety. That's circuit, it's a metaphor, obviously. You have a biological system that mediates anxiety. All of you have it. Animals have it. You have one for something called incentive reward, and that's what moves you towards valued goals. That's basically associated with positive emotion. You have one that satisfies you when you consume. That's a consummatory reward system. Lust, that's another one. Thirst, hunger. Play, that's cool. That's a fundamental circuit. Panksepp discovered that. There's a circuit for care. That's another one. And there's a circuit for rage. That's not all of them, but that's a good start. Rage. It's there right from the beginning. If you do facial expression coding analysis of infants, say an infant learns to recognize its mother, and then that's around 9 months often, or even earlier than that. So a person comes into the baby's room and the baby starts to cry because that person isn't the mother. And you think, oh, the baby's sad. It's like, no, the baby isn't sad. The baby is angry. That's why it's turning red. And if you do facial expression coding, it's like the baby is actually, the baby is cursing internally. And you already know this because you know that like a 2-year-old isn't much older than a baby, and 2-year-olds have temper tantrums, and it's not because they're sad, as you can tell perfectly well if you just watch a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum. It's clear that they're completely possessed by rage. And that rage circuit, it's exactly right. That rage circuit is active even before the fear circuit is active. It's activated very early. And one of the things that's the case is that some children are much more aggressive than others, right from the beginning. And most of those are boys. And not all of them, but most of them. And if you take 2-year-olds and you group them together, you find if you take 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, all the way up to 16, and you group them together, they don't know each other, and then you count aggressive actions, the 2-year-olds are by far the most aggressive bunch. They kick and hit and bite and steal. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And so, and 16-year-olds don't do that when you put them together. And look, you're all here, and you're not 16, you're like 30, and you're not doing any of that. And so 2-year-olds, man, they're aggressive little monsters. And it's okay because they're small and soft, and what the hell can they do, you know? So it's not like, you know, it's not blood warfare among 2-year-olds, but it's just because they don't have the sophistication and the weapons. They've got they've got the motivation. And it's really true. It's really true for a subset of them. So about 5% of 2-year-old boys are hyper-aggressive. But what's cool is that almost all of them are socialized into civilized behavior by the time they're 4. And you can define civilized behavior actually quite nicely using a Piagetian definition, is that other children will play with them. And that's rule 5, by the way. Don't let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. What's your job if you're a parent? Your job as a parent is to socialize your children so that by the age of 3, other children will play with them. Because that means they've learned how to engage in reciprocal social interactions, and that'll start to spiral upwards. So if your child is acceptable as a playmate by the age of 3, age of 4 is the limit, by the way, so you better have it together by then. Otherwise they get alienated and isolated and they don't make friends, and then they never recover from that. It's not good. It's not good. So most kids are socialized, even the hyper-aggressive ones are socialized into acceptable playmates by the age of 4. And it's men in large part that do that. Now, what's the evidence for that? Well, there's lots of evidence for it. The evidence among mammals is the use of rough and tumble play, for example, among males and their offspring in order to socialize and civilize them. But the evidence among human beings is that where do you get aggressive teenagers? What sort of families produce aggressive teenagers? Fatherless families. Right, so let's think about that with regards to what the APA said. Okay, because what they said was the opposite of the truth. It wasn't even a lie. It wasn't even wrong. It was, they took the truth and then they claimed the opposite on 2 dimensions. Number 1, aggression isn't socialized. Civilization is socialized. Number 2, if men were responsible for the creation of aggression among boys, then fatherless families would produce boys that were more peaceful. And they don't. So what the hell, fundamentally? All right, so you have the behavioral pattern that characterizes civilized behavior among wolves, or civilized behavior among chimpanzees, or civilized behavior among rats. I'll tell you the rest of the rat story. So rats like to engage in rough and tumble play. especially juveniles, especially juvenile males. And we know they like it because they'll work to do it. So if they know that if a rat has been somewhere and he got to play, and then you put him back there and you make him press a bar to open the door so he can go into where he played, he'll press that bar like mad. And so that's how you infer motivation among rats. Will the rat work to play? You will, right? Which is why you'll pay for tickets to a basketball game. Hell, you'll work to watch people play. Right. That's very interesting. It's absolutely, that's so important. It's almost unbelievable that you will do that. I mean, because the question is, well, why? That's the first question. Well, seriously, it's like, what the hell? What are you watching a bunch of pituitary cases go, bang a ball so that they can throw it through a hoop? And you'll pay outrageous sums of money to do that. It's like you're not even throwing the damn ball. You're just watching them do it. Can I have the ball? No. Well, I paid $200 for this ticket. They don't get the ball. It's like, you don't get to play. Okay, well, I'll just watch. It's like, so that's how important it is. That's how important play is, that you'll work to make money to buy tickets to watch people play. Right, man, that's crazy. So, but it's fundamental, and you think about how much of our entertainment is associated with exactly that. You think, well, were we just doing something random? Or is there something important going on there? I mean, it doesn't look that important. In some sense, it's easy to be cynical about it, but it's foolish because it's crucially important, the fact that we're so wired up to admire fair play that we'll pay for it, we'll pay for the right just to watch it vicariously. That's a testament to the degree to which we're civilized and social, because a game is something that's civilized and social. Back to Piaget. Piaget believed that most socialization occurred as a consequence of integrating these underlying motivational systems into iterable games. And that's what you're doing with your kids, right? When you socialize your kids, when you teach them how to take turns, when you teach them how to play a game, then what you're doing is that you're socializing them into iterated reciprocal interactions with other people. And that's the fundamental aspect of the ethic. That's how an ethic emerges from the bottom up. It emerges in games. That was Piaget's fundamental observation. Much better than the Freudian hypothesis. The Freudian hypothesis was basically that human beings learn to inhibit their aggression. That's not Piaget's model. Piaget's model is, no. You integrate the aggression into a higher order game. And you know this because you want an athlete, a good athlete, is someone who's got that aggression. But it's directed, right? It's not random. In fact, if you see an athlete manifest random aggression, you're not happy about that, right? Maybe you admire them because they're really competitive, highly skilled, really competitive. They're goal-driven. They want to win. But it's all focused on the goal. And, they're cooperating with their teammates. And they're not hogging the ball. They're also facilitating the development of their teammates. And they don't cheat. They don't break the rules. So they're cooperating even with their adversaries. Because they're all playing basketball and they're all playing by the rules. It's all cooperative. That's an ethic. It's an emergent ethic. And the things that we do, what we do in our lives outside of the game is very game-like. We engage in a cooperative and competitive ethic. And we know the good players, we know the good sports, and that's the bottom-up emergence of an ethic. And it's also the solution to the postmodern conundrum, as far as I'm concerned, or part of the solution, because the postmodernists claim that there's an infinite way of looking at the world, and there is, and that no way of looking at the world is better than any other way, which is wrong. The first part's right, because the world's very complicated. The second part's wrong. There aren't that many ways of playing a game properly. And you can tell that too, because even if you watch kids play, if you go out and you watch your kids play, you can tell which kids are good sports and which ones aren't. Right? That's easy. And the kids can tell too. And so you can tell when it doesn't matter what the game is, and if you're a good sport, it's the same across games, which is really another indication of the emergence of a transcendent ethic, right? If you're the concept good sportsman is independent of the game, right? And it's very much what it is that you want. It's the dawning of the behaviors that you want from someone who's sophisticated and reciprocal in their day-to-day life. And it's by no means arbitrary. It's in fact very tightly constrained. Back to the rats. So rats like to wrestle. And so you can get them to work to wrestle. And so they work, and then the door opens and out they go. And